Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So today we're going to be looking at another PS1 classic, The Legend of Dragoon, released in 1999, developed by Japan Studio and Sony Interactive Entertainment. So this is going to be a pretty long review, because I have a lot to say about this game and I have a lot of mixed feelings on it, as well as quite a bit of nostalgia for it. It's a game that I have a bit of a bizarre history with. So as I mentioned before, the game came out in 1999 when I was about 5 years old, and although most of my memories from that time period are pretty vague, one thing I do specifically remember is that my cousin, who was a few years older than me, had this game, and I remember we played through it and had an absolute blast. It was most likely my first ever experience with JRPGs, or any RPG for that matter, making this game particularly memorable for me. A few years later, with the release of the 6th generation consoles, if I remember rightly, my cousin sold the game, along with most of his PS1 collection. I don't know that for certain because we haven't actually spoken in years. Weirdly enough, he lives in Japan now, but I digress. So I played the game with my cousin as a kid, but never owned it myself until recently. Either way, as time went on, the game basically drifted off into obscurity, and as far as I'm aware, it never got a sequel, and I don't think it sold quite as well as other JRPGs of its era. As the years went on, the game became increasingly rare to find, and increasingly expensive to buy. A lot of this can be attributed to the fact that the game comes on 4 discs, which is rare for a PS1 game, as well as having 2 separate manuals. And as you might expect, this led to a lot of people losing or breaking parts of it. Finding a full set intact nowadays will set you back quite a bit of money. As it happens, I was recently in a second-hand gaming store, looking for some old retro games to play and review, and when looking at the rare games, I noticed that they had this game locked up behind a glass cabinet with all the most rare, expensive games. I noticed it almost right away. I noticed that they had the case with all 4 discs and both manuals intact, with the discs in acceptable condition. They were charging £120 on the price tag, which is more than I would usually pay for one game. But I thought to myself, you know what, if I don't buy the game now, I probably never will. Since the longer I leave it, the price tag is only going to go up higher and higher. So I bought the game and decided to play and review it. As you can see, the game comes on 4 discs, which should give you an idea of the size and scale of the game, as well as the amount of content it has to offer. Which for a PS1 game is a lot. Yeah, this game is huge. And if I were to use one word to describe it, it would be the word ambitious. So the game is a classic turn-based JRPG, similar in many ways to games such as Final Fantasy, and even Lord of the Rings The Third Age, which some of you might remember I reviewed on here a while back. As I mentioned before, the game comes on 4 discs, each disc consisting of 1 episode. Yeah, if this game came out nowadays, I'd imagine these would be sold separately, and would be filled with microtransactions, but I digress. The story of the game is a pretty interesting one, and I'd say it's probably one of the game's strongest attributes. The game takes place in a fictional medieval-style fantasy world known as Endiness, which is split up into various kingdoms. The game begins with a pre-rendered cutscene. The village of sailors, which is a peaceful little settlement in the east of Serico, comes under attack from the Sandora army. After laying waste to the village and slaughtering most of its inhabitants, the army kidnaps a young woman named Shanna for unknown reasons, and takes her to a nearby prison.
Is this really necessary?
It is His Majesty, Emperor Dole's command, to take that girl into custody.
Who is she?
That is not your concern.
You start the game off as Dart, a young sword-wielding adventurer who acts as a protagonist for the game. Dart is travelling on his way back to Salus, where he is attacked by a green dragon. He's rescued by a mysterious woman named Rose, who informs him of the fate of Salus, prompting Dart to return to Salus quickly and wipe out the remaining Sandora soldiers, rescuing the few survivors of the village. The survivors inform him of Shanna's kidnapping, since Dart and Shanna were childhood friends and have history. Dart decides to embark on a quest to rescue her. As you travel through various locations, Dart will come across several new characters who will join your party. As you travel through the wilderness, as what is standard for most JRPGs of this kind, you will come across various battles, some of which are scripted when you reach certain locations, others are randomly triggered while traversing certain areas. Early in the game you get a few useful and in-depth training tutorials that serve to familiarise you with the game's controls and gameplay mechanics, as well as the combat and items. These tutorials are very helpful since if you're not too familiar with JRPGs, then the game might be a bit of a steep learning curve. The combat of the game is very interesting and a bit more complicated than some JRPGs. You are pitted into a battle arena which will depend on the area you're currently traversing, and you will have a turn-based battle with one or more enemies. You can strike your enemy by selecting attack, or you can choose not to attack and instead defend. This gives you a small health boost and lessens the effect of your enemy's next attack, effectively acting as a block. This can be very useful, particularly early in the game when you're playing at low levels. As far as the attacking goes, you begin the game with a standard attack known as an addition. Additions are basically attack moves that are unlocked one at a time as you progress through the game and level up your characters. You activate these additions by selecting the attack button and performing a QuickTime event. Each attribute will have a specific QuickTime event that will have to be performed correctly to complete each stage of the attack. You will have to press square at the correct time during the QuickTime event in order to finish it and get the most out of it. As you reach higher levels, these additions will become more and more powerful and effective, with each of them leveling up as you use them successfully. And the later additions that are unlocked have QuickTime events that are longer, more complicated and more convoluted. This differs from a game like The Third Age, where if you remember, in that game you just select each attack and its effectiveness and accuracy is purely based on stats and luck. In this game you take a more active role in making the most out of each of your attacks, by getting used to and performing these QuickTime events. I enjoyed these in the early part of the game when they were more simple and easy to get used to. Plus the early enemies in the game are not HP sponges like in the later levels where some battles can last quite a long time, particularly boss battles, more on those later. I have to be honest though, sometimes I did get a bit frustrated with some of these QuickTime events. The early ones are pretty easy to pull off, and once you get used to them they're not much of a problem, but some of the later ones are a pain in the ass and very difficult to get used to. Those of you who are familiar with this game will probably know the ones I'm referring to. Gust of Wind Dance in particular is a really annoying attribute with a QuickTime event that feels almost impossible to pull off. I didn't even bother to stick with it and just reverted back to using an older one. You can switch between these at any time other than combat in the menu, and whatever attributes you prefer and which ones work best for you is the ones that you should probably stick with. Some of the longer and more complicated additions also leave you vulnerable to being countered. As you enter into these battles, you strike enemies with combinations, pulling off your QuickTime events. Then the indicator for the QuickTime event will suddenly turn red. This means that rather than pressing square, you will need to press circle in order to continue attacking, while avoiding the counter. Being countered leads to your addition not completing and you being sent back to your starting position, taking some damage in the process, which is of course very frustrating. This helps to spice up the combat a bit and it adds a bit of a welcome challenge. You also do have to rely on luck a bit here and there because sometimes your attacks will miss the enemy, and sometimes the enemy's attacks will miss you. Another addition to the combat is elemental attacks. Each character in the game, including enemies, will have their own elemental attribute, which is determined by a colour that you can see surrounding their name. Certain characters will be more resistant to certain elements. For example, a fire-based enemy will be more effective at resisting fire attacks, while more susceptible to water attacks, and vice versa. Likewise, wind and earth do more damage to one another. This is important to remember since certain higher level enemies may be more susceptible to taking damage from elemental magical attacks. As you play through the game you will be able to find and acquire certain items. Some of these items serve to do magical damage to enemies and are incorporated into the game's combat. Be sure to save these for moments when you really need to use them, such as difficult boss battles, and enemies that seem to be designed to drag out the game a bit. The game does have some very annoying difficulty spikes here and there, more on that later. So yeah, these elemental items are very important and can bail you out in tough fights. You also once again get a useful training tutorial that teaches you how to use these. In addition to the magical items, there are also other items such as healing potions and potions that cure certain things, such as poison and paralysis. There are also more magic-based combat additions, added later in the game. As you reach certain points in the story, each character will one at a time be given a dragoon spirit. These are infused with the power of dragons, giving each character immense power, allowing them to turn into a dragoon. These Dragoons spawn a cool suit of armour with wings, and you even get a pretty cool transformation cutscene, which shows your character becoming a Dragoon. Each character has their own unique transformation, and these look pretty cool and badass. Thankfully though, you can choose to turn these cutscenes off in the menu at any time outside of combat if you get tired of watching them, because they do get a bit tedious after a while. In addition to a cool suit of armour and wings, each character will also have a new melee attack. This gives you another quick time event to perform, which leads to a huge and badass melee attack. Once again, these look great and are really unique to each character. I noticed that if you're able to perform the quick time event perfectly, then these can sometimes do significantly more damage. These can really make a difference in tough boss battles, and they of course look pretty cool. In addition to the Dragoon's melee attacks, you also get to use magic. Each character will have their own spells that serve several functions, such as combat and healing. Some spells are quite basic and pretty much useless at higher levels, and others are much bigger and much more over the top. The spells each require varying amounts of magic points to use. These points can of course be replenished with items, as can other statistics. Some of these spells are so badass, and some of these animations are completely over the top. These are insane and I love it. The game has a lot of enemy variety. Most of the enemies in the game are based on fantasy style creatures, and many of them have a really interesting and unique design. You get your traditional fantasy style enemies, such as orcs and goblins, and even enemies that look like Yoda.
Double slash!
You have some weird and unusual enemies such as a cursed jaw, and even some more horror themed enemies such as ghosts and dark enemies, manticores, minotaurs and several others. There are a lot of interesting enemies and their designs are quite cool. Each enemy will occupy a specific location in the game, and as I mentioned before, can be encountered either in scripted locations or randomly while traversing the game. You can also return to these areas when you've leveled up a bit later, and take on the easy enemies to farm experience points and level up further. Although the experience points you get for it are very few in number, you're probably better off just using boss battles to level up. Some random occurrences in these boss battles is that enemies will sometimes pick your pocket rather than attacking, or even run away. When enemies run away, you don't get any experience points for defeating them. As far as the playable characters go, each of them is unlocked one at a time at specific points in the story. You start the game off as Dart, with him serving as the game's protagonist, and setting out to save Shanna. On the way you find the likes of Lavitz, Rose, Haschel, Kongol and several others. What I like about it is that most of the characters have their own fighting style, and each of them feels significantly different from others. For the most part, 2 of them are reskinned versions of another. There are 9 playable characters altogether, and 2 of them get replaced at a point, leaving 7 characters in your party at most. Each of them has their own elemental resistance and their own weapon. Dart carries a sword, Lavitz carries a spear, as well as Albert, who is basically a reskinned version of Lavitz. Rose is quick and agile and carries a dagger. Shanna is an archer who relies on her bow and arrow to attack enemies from long range, as is Miranda. This can also be used to hit enemies who are off the ground and can't be hit by melee attacks. You have Meru, who wields a big hammer, Kongol, who is a big brutish gigantor who carries a massive axe, and you have Haschel, who doesn't need a weapon, instead he uses his fist. Yeah, Haschel is so hard he just punches anything in his way. His fists are practically deadly weapons.
Take that!
Each character also has their own unique Dragoon magic, as well as attributes that make them more effective against certain types of enemies. Some characters are more durable than others, such as Kongo, who can absorb significantly more damage than Rose, while she has certain dark magic abilities that make her very useful. Each character is very useful in their own way, and depending on what you like and what playstyle suits you specifically, whatever team you choose is really up to you. You can have 3 playable characters in your party at a time, and this does add a bit of replay value to the game, since you could always replay it using different combinations of characters. I love the way that the game's story progresses, and how the characters bond with one another, and as they get to know each other, you get to learn more about each character's backstory, personality and goals. You even get several flashbacks throughout the game that perfectly explain why each character is there, and why they continue to persist in the quest. There is also a romantic subplot that is integrated into the game pretty well, and doesn't feel in any way forced or contrived. You learn very early on that Dart and Shanna are practically made for one another, and this develops throughout the game's story. One thing that will likely put a lot of modern day players off, however, is the lack of voice dialogue. This is one of them games where rather than have voice dialogue between the characters, you instead have to read text boxes. This doesn't bother me since I'm used to games like Morrowind where there's plenty of reading, but I would imagine a lot of modern day gamers would be put off by this. The game has several pretty epic boss battles. In my experience of JRPGs of this kind, boss battles are often the most memorable thing about them, and this game has plenty of them, and each of them is unique and badass. Some of them are very challenging too, particularly late in the game. You take on several giant creatures such as dragons of various kinds. These huge terrors called virages. These show up from time to time and are incredibly tough. You even fight a kraken at one point. The boss battles are awesome. Just like in the best RPGs, the game has plenty of slower, more story-driven moments between the combat and exploration of the game. There are various areas and levels to explore. There are wilderness areas such as woods, caves and forests, as well as swamps and old abandoned temples. There are also several towns, villages and cities to explore. These act as kind of hub areas for you to relax and do some role-playing. There are several shops and merchants scattered around the game. Here you can purchase several items and even buy some new armor and weapons for your party. These get much more effective as the game goes on. You can also find items and weapons in chests scattered around the game. These can be found in both the hub areas and the wilderness, and are often hidden in maze-like areas. There are also doctors who can restore some of your attributes for a small price, as well as inns where you can pay to stay the night and rest, healing your entire party. In addition to these, you have rest points that you can find in the wilderness that serve the same function, such as fresh water and various other healing curiosities. This again gives the game so much replay value and gives you an incentive to explore as much as possible, to find all the best items and weapons. You can also find items called Stardust, hidden in inconspicuous locations in the game. These can be used to obtain unique items later in the game. Be sure to examine the world around you to try to find some of these. Between the towns and the wilderness areas of the game, you will also have a world map with a pre-rendered background. This connects each of the game's locations together and allows you to traverse the world. As I mentioned before, this game is huge. There are so many locations to visit and there's quite a bit of backtracking also. You can also run into battle encounters while traversing the world map, so be prepared for that. You can save game by finding save points and can also save at any time during the world map. Be sure to save often, as the game does have some quite annoying difficulty spikes as I mentioned before. This brings me to some of the negatives and some of the criticisms I have for the game. First of all, the difficulty spikes. These difficulty spikes always seem to be in the most inconvenient locations. Rather than directly after a save point, there are specific boss battles and enemies that seem to have been designed specifically for padding out the game's length, which is really not necessary at all since the game is already very long, with plenty of replay value. So I do have some issues there. Also, the game does get to a point where it kind of outstays its welcome. What I mean by that is, while I really enjoyed the game's story, it does start to drag a bit. There are levels in the game which have an unnecessary amount of backtracking, and dialogue which just seems to be filler. The combat of the game does start to get a bit repetitive too, and as I mentioned before, some of the quick time events later in the game are just way too hard. This caused me a lot of frustration. There were times during several battles where I wanted to rage quit. The game's graphics and presentation are also a bit of a mixed bag. The backgrounds and environments look really nice, and the levels all look unique, as well as the battle arenas, which look fine. But the character models are very blocky and weird looking, even for 1999. You do have to take into consideration the technical limitations at the time. This is a PS1 game after all, as well as the sheer size of this game and how much content it has to offer, so I can't be too harsh when discussing its visual aesthetic. On a positive note, the pre-rendered cutscenes look great. These look fantastic for the time, and the character models in them look very realistic compared to most games at the time. The game also has an incredible soundtrack. I've said several times in reviews that a soundtrack can make or break a game. This game has music that perfectly suits the tone and style of each level or situation. This is particularly important when you have a game with no voice dialogue, because the music has to accurately convey the tone. Peaceful, relaxing situations have a tune that conveys that. As well as confrontations. And even sadder and more emotional scenes. And of course, sweet, romantic interactions. Great music. So yeah, the soundtrack of the game is great. Adding to the variety of the game, you do have some mini-games and distractions, such as a memory game, an obstacle course, and even a cooking mini-game where you have to chop vegetables while competing against another cook. That was quite fun. These are very simplistic, and you could really have cut them out of the game and it wouldn't have made much of a difference. But again, they do their bit to add some replay value and some variety to the game. One issue I have with the game is the fact that there are certain items and some collectibles that are very unlikely to obtain, and certain content that the game either doesn't tell you about or makes unnecessarily complicated. For example, as I mentioned before, every one of your characters has a Dragoon spirit that will be unlocked at a specific point in the game. Most of the characters you unlock get their Dragoon spirit shortly after you unlock them at a predetermined point in the story. Yet for some reason I was playing through this game and I noticed Kongo didn't have his yet, despite the fact I was quite close to the end of the game. So before going any further, I had a quick look online and I found that, unlike the other characters, Kongo's Dragoon spirit can actually be purchased shortly after he's unlocked in the game, all the way back in Disc 2. I completely missed this, and from what I can remember, there was little to no indication of this anywhere. So I went the vast majority of the game without Kongo's Dragoon powers. I did go back and purchase it while I was about midway through Disc 4, so I did get it. Yeah, thank God you can go back, but it's just a little bit annoying that I could have had it all that time and didn't. There is another way to get it at a predetermined point, but that's near the end of the game, so you're better off buying it sooner. There are also items that you need to complete a particular puzzle to obtain, and this is purely luck based and practically impossible and a complete waste of time. I'm sure you guys who have played through this game know what I'm talking about. Ghost Ship Chest. So yeah, as great as this game is, there are a few annoying nitpicks, and things about it that felt like padding. On the back of the case, it states that the game has about 80 hours of gameplay. This is true, but the problem is that a lot of that is just padding and backtracking, and a lot of it could have been cut out. One problem that I ran into while playing through and recording this game, and this isn't a criticism of the game itself, just more of a hardware issue. So I played through the game on my PS2, since PS1 games are backwards compatible, and I noticed that the game would often freeze during the transition between battles and the regular game, particularly after completing boss battles. At first I thought this was my disc, yet it kept happening with all 4 discs despite neither of them being in particularly bad condition. So again, I did some research online and it turns out that that's actually a common problem when playing this on a PS2. For some reason it just can't seem to run the game very well. So if you're going to play this game, I would recommend playing it on an original PlayStation rather than a PS2. Again, this isn't a criticism of the game itself, it's just a hardware issue, but I digress. So all in all, I think The Legend of Dragoon is a great game, and a worthy RPG that I would recommend you check out. However, despite the great story, combat and overall design, there are certain things about the game that haven't aged well. And as I mentioned before, the game has quite a bit of padding, as well as some pointless backtracking that could easily have been cut out, and some easily missed items. A few things about the game do feel tacked on and unfinished, such as the mini-games, and if truth be told, the game does outstay its welcome quite a bit. Nonetheless, the game is great for the most part, and if you like turn-based JRPGs of this kind, then you could certainly do a lot worse. I give it a solid 7 out of 10, which I think is a fair score. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed playing and reviewing The Legend of Dragoon. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.